Hello, and welcome to part 12 of the series, which is actually going to the 23rd of September, and it's going to be 14 parts. And most importantly, I need to actually, as I'm now recording this, actually change my date round, because it is not the 19th. It is now the 20th of September. And today we're talking about Henning von Holtzendorff. Now, in some of these videos, I have talked about the risk fleet theory and its coming, and especially in the lives I've talked about that. And I'm going to probably do another video where I go into that and its effects and do a proper examination of Tirpitz and the risk fleet. But one of the things you have to remember is that he is honestly not as universally accepted as often seems to be the case when you read a general history. Not in the German Navy. In fact, there are people who oppose his policy of building against Britain. There are people who oppose his policy of aggression, people who think that actually this is not a way to win a war or deter conflict. And today we're going to be talking about one of those, Henning von Holtzendorff. Before I get into that, I'm going to quickly talk about the spreadshirt saw. Now, the reason I'm going to talk about the spreadshirt saw is because there's a link down below. The reason I'm talking about it is because since I set this up, people wanted some merchandise. Thought it would be nice to contribute and get those things. And it's lovely and very kind. It's the same reason I have Patreon, and the same reason that you can join the channel and super chats and all that is enabled and adverts are enabled, is because the money goes to supporting my research and supporting me doing more research. It's all very nice of you. Is, of course, if you've watched more of these videos, or you will know. If you haven't watched any of these videos, you won't. My aunt, when she saw this store set up, said, right, if you manage to double your subscribers by the 31st of December, I will wear Blackburn face mask, and I will get Uncle to wear one, and we'll take a picture. Thank you very much. The trouble is, doubling my subscribers means getting to 13,000 subscribers, and currently, as we speak, I'm at 6,634. So I need another 6,366. Help, please. It's for familial bragging rights. So please, a little help. Thank you. Right, let's get to the proper history and away from the familial bragging rights. Henning von Holtzendorff. He's the Commander-in-Chief of the High Seas Fleet, 1909 to 1913. And he is one very experienced naval officer. He's born to a noble family in Berlin in January 1853. So, in the nicest way, by 1913, when he is first to retire for the first time, he's 60 years old. He joins the Navy in 1969 at the age of 1869. Serves in the Franco-Prussian War. Then is sent as a staff officer to West Africa Squadron. He reaches the rank of captain. I was captain as we'd understand it. In 1897. He then serves during the Boxer Rebellion in charge of a cruiser with the East Asia Squadron. Then serves as Chief of Staff at the Baltic Sea Naval Station, and then director of the Imperial Shipyard at Danzig, before going on to become a vice admiral in 1904. Then he becomes in 1906 commander of the first battle squadron, and by 1909 he of course commands the High Seas Fleet, a full admiral by 1910. He is experienced. He is tough. And he makes some very, very difficult decisions in World War One, and goes down a very dark road, you can argue. He is forced to retire because his opposition to the rapid German naval expansion and its competition with the Royal Navy. He doesn't think that that is sensible. And there's nothing wrong with not thinking that's sensible. His argument is that he's been in charge at Danzig. He knows exactly how many ships can be built. The Germans can't build a fleet to match the British. The British can outbuild them every way, 6 ways till Sunday. There is no point. The British have a bigger industry and can therefore move tech more. They can suddenly make jumps to Queen Elizabeth class and churn out oodles of 15-inch gun battleships without even blinking. He is the person sitting in the room going, I've served the British. I know the British. I've been around the world looking at the British. I have commanded our battle fleet, our battle squadrons, our battle fleet, and I have commanded in our construction yards. I have a fairly accurate idea, therefore, of what the realities of the circumstances are. This is not a sensible strategy. And he's forced to retire. However, World War One goes so well, and I mean so well, for the Germans that the commander of the German Navy, the chief of the naval staff, Bachmann, is forced out in 1915. And the only one who can be brought back is Holtzendorff, who has been a member of the Prussian House of Lords for that time, and basically he's been a very important political person for those last few years. The reason Bachmann is forced out is because he advocates for unrestricted submarine warfare against the British and bombing of civilian targets, which Kaiser Wilhelm disagreed with and so forced him to resign. And Holtzendorff is back. And, of course, what is Holtzendorff going to be most famous for? He persuades the Kaiser to go for unrestricted submarine warfare. But we'll get on to that. First thing he does, well, starts off the submarine warfare. Because, if in doubt, you've got to have the submarines going. And his key decisions are to massively invigorate submarine warfare, to start up mine laying. He positions vessels like you see small coastal boat, which was the first mine layer of its type, and starts using them to deploy mines all around Britain. At first, the British think that they must be neutral trawlers being used to deploy the mines. In fact, they are these little submarines. And when they capture one of these submarines, they realize and go, "Oh, you little..." Why does he push for submarine warfare? Why? Why does an officer who is a battleship officer push, definitely a battleship and cruiser officer, as dyed in the wool as you can think, pushing for this? Because of the same reason he advocated not going to war. This is kind of the complex path which most of the Japanese admirals seem to go through, a large number of them, especially the ones from the treaty faction. They advocated against war. In fact, a lot of the admirals in the Japanese Navy, even some of them from the fleet faction, advocated against war. It wasn't viable. But if you're forced to fight war, you have to figure out a way to win it. The thing is, Holtzendorff never thought you could win it Tirpitz's way. You could never beat the British with battleship construction. They have too many yards, they have too many ships, they have too bigger industry, they have too big an advantage. You can't make up that lack of infrastructure. So, that means you have to whittle the enemy down. So he does a few things. One, he goes into battle with the army to get as much funding and as much supplies as he can get. And Holtzendorff is a wily politician when it comes to fighting the army. We think of Tirpitz, we think of the various Navy ministers. No. They are mere kinder compared to what Holtzendorff manages to achieve. In the middle of World War I, when the army is screaming out with battles all over the place, crying for all the funding they can get, he manages to get more funding for various pet projects. That takes skill. Pet projects include submarines. Pet projects include trying to finish as many cruisers and battleships as he can. He's actually quite cutthroat. He goes through the ships and goes, "We can finish that, we can finish that, we can repair that, we can't repair that, we can't finish that, we don't have the resources." It's brutal. And let's be honest, in terms of command and the C&C of the High Seas Fleet, well, he will outlive several of those. Ingerhole, Von Pol, Scheer most of his time. Scheer will eventually succeed him, but let's be honest. Holtzendorff outlives them. He's the one who hires and fires them. Has to. But all this stuff is not what he's known for. It really isn't. What he's known for is this. And this is a translation I could find on the internet. It seems fairly viable, but it's translated to English because, as we all know, my German is not the greatest in terms of pronunciation. So, the Chief of the Admiralty Staff of the Navy, Berlin, 22nd December 1916. To the Royal Field Marshal, Chief of the General Staff of the Army, His Excellencies von Beckendorf and von Hindenburg. Great headquarters, most secret. I have the honour to respectfully submit to Your Excellency, in the attachment, a memorandum on the necessity of the commencement of an unrestricted campaign of submarine warfare at the earliest opportunity. The memorandum is essentially a continuation of the memorandum reference number 22247, I of 27th of August 1916. The merchant tonnage issue and the supply of England in 1916, which has previously been submitted to Your Excellency. I always love the way, and this happens with various nations, whenever they're at war with Britain, They talk as if they're at war with just England. And they're not. If you're at war with just England, you would have had a lot less issues than when you're at war with England, Scotland, and Wales, i.e., Britain and Northern Ireland. And most of Ireland at this point. I have to remember it's World War One. And 1916. The war requires a decision before autumn 1917, lest it should end in the mutual exhaustion of all parties and thus in disaster for us. Of our enemies, Italy and France are already so severely weakened in their economic foundations that they are kept in the fight only through England's energy and resources. If we succeed to break England's backbone, the war will immediately be decided in our favour. England's backbone is the merchant tonnage which delivers essential imports for their survival and for the military industry of the British Islands, and which ensures the kingdom's ability to pay for its imports from abroad. The current situation in respect to the merchant tonnage has already been mentioned in the memorandum of 27th August, as laid out in further detail in the attachment. In all brevity, the situation is as follows. The shipping rates have reached outrageous levels, often as much as 10 times as much as in peacetime, for many important goods. We know with certainty from a variety of sources that merchant tonnage is lacking everywhere. The current English merchant tonnage can safely be assumed to be in the order of 20 million gross registered tons. 8.6 million of these tons of these are requisitioned for military purposes, and 500,000 is employed in coastal trade. Approximately 1 million tons are undergoing repairs or otherwise temporarily unavailable. Approximately 2 million tons are sailing for other allies, which leaves about 8 million tons of English merchant tonnage to provide for the supply of England. An analysis of statistical figures of the ship movements in British ports suggests an even lower figure. In months July-September 1916, only 6.75 million tons were employed in the trade with England. In addition to that, other tonnage sailing in the trade with England can be assumed to amount to around 900,000 tons of enemy non-English and approximately 3 million tons of neutral tonnage. Hence, no more than 10.75 million gross registered tons are at disposal of supply of England. Ouch. It's interesting to note the statistical analysis going on here, but yes, he's pointing this out. What I find more interesting is that these are figures which the Admiralty more than likely knew, and yet had not started convoying at this point or anything else, because that would be sort of admitting that they weren't able to deal with problems, wouldn't it? Convoying, rather than being seen to be dealing with problems, convoying would be admitting you can't deal with the problems. Part 3, Section 3. If the achievements in our battle against merchant tonnage have been encouraging thus far, then the exceptionally poor world harvest of grain, including feed grain this year, provides us with a unique opportunity which nobody could responsibly reject. Both North America and Canada will probably cease their grain exports to England in February. Then that country will have to draw its grain supplies from the more distant Argentina. But since Argentina will only be able to deliver very limited quantities because of the poor harvest, England will have to turn to India and mostly Australia. In the attachment, it is explained in detail how such an increase in the length of the grain routes will require an extra 720,000 tons of tonnage for the grain shipments alone. In practice, the implications will be that until August 1917, 750,000 tons of the available 10.75 million tons must be employed for a service which had hitherto not been required. Under such favourable circumstances, an energetic blow conducted with all force against English merchant tonnage will promise a certain success in a way that I have to reiterate and emphasise my statements made on 27 August 1916, that our clearly defined strategic objective is to force a decision in our favour through destruction of enemy sea transport capacity. And also that, from a military point of view, it would be irresponsible not to make use of the submarine weapon now. As things stand at the moment, I cannot vouch that a campaign of unrestricted submarine warfare will force England to make a peace within 5 months' time. This reservation needs to be made in respect to the unrestricted submarine warfare campaign only. Of the currently conducted submarine warfare under a cruiser, a decisive result cannot be expected, regardless of the circumstances, even if all armed merchantmen are designated as legitimate targets. Out. He's done a statistical analysis, and he's making a case. And the case is simple. We can't win. We can't win this war. We have one shot if we can take England out, Britain out somehow. We can take Britain out of the fight. We can negotiate a treaty in our favour. Which nation does this sound like? It sounds like Japan in World War II. It sounds like Germany with what Canaris was doing in World War II. You can't win. So you're not going for a blow which will help you win. That you don't even think the blow will help you win. You're looking for a negotiated treaty in your favour. You're not an outright win-win, but enough of a win you can walk away feeling your head is held high. Again, note. There is no mention so far of what Allied response might be, or what other nations' response might be. That's coming. So, Section 5. Based on a monthly rate of destruction of 600,000 tons of shipping through a campaign of unrestricted submarine warfare, as pointed out previously, and on the well-grounded expectation, elaboration upon in the attachment, that at least 2/5 of the neutral tonnage sailing in the trade of England will be deterred by such a campaign, it stands to reason that the current volume of English seaborne trade will be reduced by 39% within 5 months. This would not be bearable for England, neither in view of her future position after the war, nor in view of her ability to continue the war effort. Already, the country is at the verge of a food crisis, which will soon compel it to attempt to undertake the same food rationing measures which we, as a blockaded country, have been forced to adopt since the outbreak of war. The preconditions for implementing such measures are totally different and infinitely more unfavourable than in our case. They do not have the necessary administration, and their population is unused to submitting to such privations. Then there is another reason why the uniform rationing of bread for the whole country will not be possible in England at this point. It was possible for Germany at a time in which bread could be substituted by other foodstuffs. That moment has been missed in England. With only 3/5 of the current seaborne trade, the continued supply of alternative foodstuffs cannot be maintained unless a severe rationing of grain is imposed, provided the war industry is to be maintained at its current output level. The objection that England could have sufficient domestic stockpiles of grain raw materials has been disproved in detail in the attachment. In addition to that, the unrestricted submarine campaign would cut off England from trade with Denmark and Holland, which would result in an immediate shortage of fats, since 1/3 of all butter imports and the entire margarine imports from England originate in Denmark and Holland, respectively. Moreover, by threatening the sea routes to Scandinavia and intensifying activities against the Spanish iron ore trade, it would result in a scarcity of iron ore and wood. This will automatically reduce the coal production for lack of wood. In consequence, it would also reduce the output of pig iron, steel, and subsequently production of munitions, which depends on both. Finally, it gives us the long hoped for opportunity to strike neutral munition shipments, and thus it will also provide a relief for the army. By contrast, a submarine campaign, according to cruiser rules, even assuming the possibility of indiscriminate attacks on our merchantmen, would only yield a reduction of the tonnage sailing for England by 400,000 tons, about 18%, or less than half what we could achieve by unrestricted submarine warfare. Experience so far does not suggest that the authorization to torpedo our merchantmen would improve upon the result of the 400,000 tons expected in the course of progressing arming of merchantmen. I'm aware that even a reduction of 1/5 of English seaborne trade will have a severe impact on the English supply situation. However, I consider it unthinkable that the current English leadership under Lloyd George, who is absolutely determined, could be forced to make peace on these grounds, particularly since the constraints of fat, iron ore, and wood scarcity and the latter's impact on munitions production would not come into effect. Furthermore, the psychological effects of panic and terror cannot be exploited. These effects, which can only be achieved by a campaign of unrestricted submarine warfare, are, in my view, an indispensable prerequisite to success. Just how important they can be judged by experiences made when we initiated submarine warfare in early 1915, or even during the period of submarine campaign in March and April 1916, when the British believed that we were serious about it. A further precondition for success is that the beginning and the declaration of unrestricted submarine warfare should coincide in a manner that leaves no room for negotiations, particularly between England and neutrals. Only then will the effect of the shock have the most profound impact on the enemy and neutrals. Okay, it's all good. I can understand all this idea. This is a nice, logical campaign, you know. Unrestricted submarine warfare, great. We can destroy far more, we can be far scarier. But this is the point at which it reminds me of it's like the risk fleet theory. It's presumptive on Britain sitting there and taking it. And no, you cannot, in your strategy, predict what your opponent will necessarily do in response to what you do. But you have to make an allowance for it. You have to, because otherwise you fundamentally undermine yourself. If you don't make allowances for what your enemy might do, you have no plan. You have a hope, a wing, and a prayer, but you have no plan. Part 6 and 7. And this is where it ends, really. Upon the declaration of unrestricted submarine warfare, the United States government once more will be compelled to make a decision whether or not to take the consequences of its previous position vis-a-vis the unrestricted submarine warfare. I'm absolutely of the opinion that war with the United States is such a serious matter that everything has to be undertaken to avoid it. Fear of a diplomatic rupture, however, should not lead us to recoil from the use of a weapon that promises victory for us. At any rate, it's realistic to assume that the worst-case scenario is the most probable one, to consider which impact an American entry into the war on the side of our enemies would have on the course of the war. In respect to merchant tonnage, this impact is likely to be negligible. It cannot be expected that more than a fraction of the interned central power tonnage in American and perhaps in other neutral ports can be put into the trade of England at short notice. The overwhelming part of it can be rendered useless in a manner that it will be unable to sell during the first critical months. All preparations in this respect have been made. Also, there will be no crews available in the initial stages. The American troops would be of equally little import, only for the lack of bottoms to carry them over here in great numbers. The same applies to American money, which cannot compensate for the lack of tonnage. The only question that remains would be how America would react to a peace, which Great Britain would be forced to accept. It is unlikely that it would decide to continue the war against us, since it has no means to strike at us decisively, whereas seaborne commerce would suffer from our submarines. Indeed, it is expected that it will join England in making peace in order to restore healthy economic conditions. Therefore, my conclusion is that a campaign of unrestricted submarine warfare, launched in time to produce a peace before the harvest of the summer 1917, i.e. 1st of August, has to accept the risk of American belligerence, because we have no other option. In spite of the diplomatic rupture of America, the unrestricted submarine warfare is nevertheless the right means to conclude this war victoriously. It's also the only means to this end. Since I have declared the time come to strike against England in autumn 1916, the situation has even improved tremendously in our favour. The crop failure, in conjunction with the impact of the war in England up to now, gives us the opportunity to force a decisive decision before next harvest. If we do not make use of what seems to be the last chance, then I see no other option than that of mutual exhaustion, without our succeeding to bring the war to an end on terms that will guarantee our future as a world power. In order to achieve the required results, the unrestricted submarine warfare has to commence no later than the 1st of February. I request from Your Excellency an indication whether the military situation on the continent, particularly in regard to remaining neutrals, would allow this schedule. The necessary preparations can be completed within 3 weeks' time. Holtzendorff. My. The Chief of Staff requires 3 things. The ability to clearly assess the strategic situation. The ability to clearly assess the people. And the ability to communicate a solution. Communicated a solution is assess the people. I would not agree with this assessment of Britain and America. But he's in a situation where there is no good answer. What other options are there? Let's be honest, this is a man who knew so strongly that in 1909 1910, 1911, 1912, and 1913. He was arguing with everyone because he knew the risk fleet strategy didn't work. And he's got a weapon which theoretically might help. On paper it might achieve it. What can he do? What can he do? How can he deal with it? Unrestricted submarine warfare it is. There are problems. There are problems with unrestricted submarine warfare. There's a problem with expanding the area on the Atlantic Ocean. Plans like operations like the Deutschland visit of Deutschland to America have been great. They had provided some key resources. We're talking small volume, high value cargoes. Critical resources. Keep the German war effort going. But at the same time, actions like U-53 off the coast of America, just outside in international waters, sinking merchant ships belonging to the Allies or otherwise interesting cargoes in those international waters in sight of American warships had caused upset. And then you have people like this. William J. Bryan, who had resigned following the third note sent over Lusitania from Wilson's government. Just thought it was too aggressive. America is not a country which, upon the face of it, wants war. You can understand Holtzendorff's perspective. He's looking at the headlines. You can also understand his perspective on the British. He's looking again at the headlines. They're weak, soft. They're not like strong Germans, strong Prussians, who are used to suffering for victory, for war, for the greater good. No, they're used to having all the luxuries. They won't accept substitutes for bread. They won't, will they? During World War One, the Allies would lose 5,000 merchant ships, thereabout. Roughly 15,000 merchant sailors killed. They'd lose 104 warships. And roughly 61 Q ships. The Germans would lose 217 U-boats and 6,000 sailors. Specifically, after this memo, after this decision, this resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare, Holtzendorff is forced to get the Kaiser's agreement by assuring the Majesty, the Kaiser, he says to the Kaiser, I give you your Majesty my word as officer that not one American will land on the continent. I think Donitz probably made similar promises to Hitler. Didn't work out that well either. Most of this stuff was put together based on a study by a gentleman called Dr. Richard Fuss. Always good to get academics involved. But before we get too massive about the American involvement, all the other things coming, at this point in January 1917, there was already 190 Allied divisions in Europe to 150 German ones. They had 105 submarines ready for action on the 1st of February. And for most of 1917, they would have 120 available. Despite losses, thanks to construction and getting crews available, they would keep maintaining roughly 120 at sea. They nearly hit their targets of 500,000 tons in February and March. They get to 860,000 tons in April. And in April time, Britain has 6 weeks' supply of wheat. Losses exceeded 600,000 tons in May, 700,000 tons in June, and in all those first 3 months of the campaign, Germany only lost 9 submarines. Unfortunately, on the 3rd of February, in response to the campaign beginning, President Wilson severed all diplomatic relations with Germany, and Congress would declare war on the 6th of April. However, in that meantime, a gentleman called Henderson, who was a commander at the time, would write a report. And that report would go to another gentleman called Jellicoe. Now, Jellicoe became First Sea Lord and therefore in charge of the issues in November. Well, he'd been put in post in November 1916, so was in charge and dealing with them from the very beginning in terms of this new campaign. But he manages, with some manipulation of the various politicians and with the report, Jellicoe gets convoying to be introduced. Now, first of all, it's supposed to be conducting experiments, and convoys are not in general use till August 1917, by which time the losses have started to drop off. Q ships have become more successful, and to be honest, the German submarines are starting to tire out from keep being used, the tempo of operations. You know, when you consider how many submarines they are managing to get out out of the ones they have available and how many they've got operational out of their entire fleet, you realize it's a very high tempo of operations that Holtzendorff has managed to achieve. Of course, Jellicoe ends up being forced out in December by Guedes, later famous for the Guedes Axe. And there's various views about what reasons to sack him. Some suggest there had been actual intelligence about an attack on a Norwegian convoy, and he hadn't done anything despite this reliable information about a German attack coming on it. And to be honest, the reason why Jellicoe hadn't done much was where was he going to get the supplies from? He was already running convoys at that point. That's in October. He's got the convoys. All the ships he's got available are already busy. He can't magically make ships appear from nowhere, but the politicians do sometimes seem to think that with Jellicoe. But the thing is, to get the right supplies, Holtzendorff and for their operations, and this is the interesting thing and why I'm talking about, Holtzendorff and Jellicoe both had to manipulate politicians. Jellicoe, to get the money and support to get the convoys, get the escorts for the convoys, without affecting the ability of the ground fleet to operate, i.e. to get more escorts built and get them built rapidly, i.e. get the Corvette program and all those things going. He had to play a dangerous double bluff. He had to basically keep protesting that, they couldn't do convoying. We don't have any ships for convoying. We don't have this, to get the funding. And I think that's often why Jellicoe is being as pessimistic as he is, even though he's got the reports he has. And we know he's got those reports. Because we know what he does to protect the people who provide him those reports from other officers who don't like the contents of those reports. Now, if Jellicoe's protecting the officers who produce those reports, that suggests those reports are helpful to him. Holtzendorff has to do the same thing. And Holtzendorff his campaign, of course, is to keep funding for the Navy and keep trying to fund the submarines because he sees that as the only option. He's promoted to Grand Admiral on the 31st of July, 1918. The final appointment of any officer to that rank in the Imperial Navy. However, he starts to quarrel with the Supreme Army Command, the Ossi-Husseltung. Why does he quarrel with them? Because they are not going to win the war. There is no way they can win the war, especially now American troops are arriving. And honestly, he's also quite annoyed with them because part of his planning and his arguing was based on the information they was feeding him from their supposed informants in America and their informants in Britain and their intelligence. And this is where the Abwehr gets the bad reputation it has in the interwar years and leading up to World War II and during World War II to an extent in many parts of the German military, because the intelligence information they'd been giving had been compromised in many points by the British. you must remember, we are gentlemen, the British. But so to an extent on the Germans. And neither side really ever quite properly understood quite how ungentlemanly they could be. So, Holtzendorff. I was going to use this slide for the verdict, but honestly, he looks a bit like Santa Claus in that picture. I'm not going there. So we're going to do this. It's the old debate of a risk fleet for deterrence or unrestricted submarine warfare to try and win. You can either build you only have the infrastructure to build one. You can't build both. Germany went into World War I building a risk fleet. The whole idea was that by having the sufficient force, the British they'd be scared. They wouldn't engage. And they wouldn't engage because Tirpitz has ordained, if they fight us, they will lose so many ships, they'll immediately be descended upon by the French, the Russians, the Americans, who will tear them apart. And that will be the end of the British Empire. And so they will never fight us. No problem. You're building a fleet, force them to actually ally with the French and the Russians. So it's unlikely they're going to descend on the British and tear them apart. And the American Navy is going to get the funding to go on a war of aggression with the British. Maybe they'll send land troops into Canada. But actually go and fight they don't need to fight the Royal Navy to send land troops into Canada. They're not going to go and take over Africa or invade India. The Royal Navy at that point is mainly going to be used to go and try and bombard America and maybe repeat, I don't know, the War of 1812 and a sack of Washington. That's not going to be that's your entire strategy, your entire deterrent philosophy is based not on being able to win the war, but being able to cause enough damage that someone else, an unidentified someone, is going to finish you off, or that the British are going to be so scared of someone else doing that they won't dare fight you. And then you whole thing backs them into a corner and forces them to ally with the French and the Russians. Whereas traditionally they've been your ally. Traditionally the British had used the Prussians, or the Germans, as they'd become, to keep the French and the Russians occupied in Europe, so they didn't have to worry about them elsewhere in the world. Brilliant system. And they build a navy and start challenging us for the rest of the world. They know the rest of the world is British. We don't want anyone else going out there. It's frankly, it was bad enough letting you all out of the can for the Boxer Rebellion. Do you realize one of you was called a world marshal? How gauche is that? That's just no. Okay, I'm just gonna quickly say this because otherwise it'll come up to me in university at some point. It's not my personal opinions. I'm basically putting forward some of the thinking at the time. So that's the reality. Okay, unrestricted submarine warfare. Two richest nations in the world at this time are probably Britain and America. Germany is definitely up there, as is France, but not as rich as Britain and America are. Both of them depend upon global trade. So you build up a massive submarine fleet prior to World War I, deploy it on the British in 1914, you might well have won. Why? Because, honestly, there is no concept in the British, really, other than destroyers and ramming submarines, by, actually, HMS Dreadnought example, of how to deal with a submarine threat in 1914. They have ideas, but they have nothing concrete. By the time you deployed in 1917, the British have been at war for 3 years. The British are actually building corvettes, they're building this, they're building that. They have, well, sloops as they're calling them. They are building all sorts of things. They have responded. And they are using their maritime infrastructure to respond. And they're building merchant ships. And the trouble is, the submarines in World War One are not as good as the ones in World War Two, but I would argue they come far closer to victory in World War One than they do and ever do in World War Two. Far, far closer to victory in World War One than they ever do in World War Two. If Holtzendorff had had the submarines, the numbers he had in 1917, in 1915, and he launched unrestricted submarine warfare, it could have been a very, very different scenario. It could have been a very, very different scenario. Unrestricted submarine warfare is in no way nice. It is in no way palatable, really, to the peacetime mind. Because it is the assassination, for want of a better phrase, of merchant ships. But I'm going to correct a couple of things. One, he did think, as you saw in that memo, there was a chance that America would join the war. He just hoped that his submarines, and he was sure his submarines, prevent their passage. The trouble is, if anything's going to be convoyed, it's going to be a troop convoy. Or they're going to be moving very fast in very fast merchant ships. I.e., cruise liners. Or liners. Secondly, he's basing his plans on the intelligence he has available and the information he has available. And they're still good plans. But he doesn't have the tools he needs to do them. If he had had the submarine fleet of Donetsk in World War II, you do not want Holtzendorff in charge. For starters, Holtzendorff does not have this concept of doing mass constant communications. In fact, whilst there are many communications which go between the ministry and the imperial staff and the fleet, which are often used to provide out information, more often than not, they're coming from the minister's office than the chief of staff. I'm not sure if the chief of staff ever, and this is from what I've read in the British intelligence things, it might be they're just ignoring the messages from Holtzendorff, so I could be completely wrong, but in the books I've read, a strong impression I've got is that he prefers to send one signal occasionally or to conduct in-person meetings. This could be because he's old-fashioned. It could be because he's less trusting of communication protocol. Or it could be, and I'm not sure if he ever said this, but the more I read about it, the more I can imagine him saying it. A version of, one does not own a dog and bark and wag your tail yourself. I.e., what is the point of having someone you trust to be in that post if you don't trust them to do the job and need to micromanage them for them to do it? And here is the big problem for Germany in World War II, and why I've got Holtzendorff and I'm discussing him here. In the interwar years, they are still following the Tirpitz dogma. That's what they're still living with. And in World War II, they end up fighting alongside the lines Holtzendorff had told them that had outlined the fight. But at no point do they realize the point which Holtzendorff seems to realize. This is not about outright victory. And if you read that sentence, that translation, if you read the German, you get the impression of language. This is not about outright victory. This is about securing a win. And there's a difference. Outright victory is crushing your enemies. Securing a win because they can't carry on fighting, or don't want to carry on fighting, because they cannot sustain the privations of what you've priced them, are different things. That is what it's been forced into. It's what it's been forced to do. So, what have I got coming up? Well, now, you've been probably noticing for a while HMS Dreadnought Day. Well, here is the sneaking little thing. It's on the 2nd of October. It's a Saturday. And if everything goes as planned, I'm hoping to do more than one live that day. The reason I'm going to break them up is I'm going to do different sections live, including one which will be a live about HMS Dreadnought, one which will be about construction leading up to World War One. One will be a construction about leading up to battleships and what they're looking at leading up to World War II. And one which will be a countdown of your favorite battleships as voted for by you in a poll on Discord or Twitter. I'm still deciding which one to go with. Discord, I have slightly more influence to make sure it doesn't end up with Bodie face. But Twitter probably get more buy-in. And considering the other thing I've got going on, the competition with my aunt for bragging rights, buy-in from a larger public does seem sensible. We'll see though. We will see. That's what we have coming up on the 2nd of October. As it is though, I will leave you with this rather impressive picture of Holtzendorff in 1906. And the simple fact is, he argues against war, he argues against the risk fleet theory, risk fleet and that strategy, and he ends up trying to come up and fit the best strategy they can make on the situation and capabilities they have. And I'm not sure if he even agrees with that strategy himself. But he comes up with it, and he pushes it, and he does his best to try and protect Germany. And I think, honestly, that if the Germany of the interwar years had focused more on the lessons of Holtzendorff and less on lionizing Tirpitz and Seametallurgy, then World War II could have been far, far more difficult for the British. Although, conversely, the odds are if they had, then the British would have responded to that. Admittedly, they'd have still been responding for potentially 3 enemies, but they would have probably adapted themselves in some way to deal with the emerging German capabilities and what they are focusing around. Thank you. Hope you enjoyed, and there's 2 more of these to go.